everybody. Welcome to the GPCE seminar series. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Fabio Sanchez from the University of Costa Rica. He receives a PhD in biological mathematics from Cornell University, and he currently works as a teacher and as a researcher at the School of Mathematics, SIMPA, of the University of Costa Rica. He mainly works on modeling infectious diseases with greater emphasis on those that are transmitted by vectors. I would like to comment that Professor Fabio Sanchez and I, we are academic brothers. We actually got a PhD under the mentorship of Professor Carlos Castillo Chavez, and we are academic grandsons of Professor Simon Levine. So welcome, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Baltasar, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today for this seminar. So as Baltasar mentioned, my research mainly consists on modeling infectious diseases, and for a long time, it was mostly vector-borne diseases, and I worked extensively on that here in Costa Rica, given the endemicity of dengue, Zika, and chikungunya, even though the last two just got to Costa Rica recently, like 2015 chikungunya and 2016 or 17 Zika, if I'm not mistaken. Today, I wanted to give an overview of recent research that I have been working on with some colleagues, including Baltasar and one of my former master students, Jimmy Calvo. It mainly relates to adaptive behavior in models. So the context here is mathematical modeling has seen a surge recently, given what happened in 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic. And the use of models was vital around the world in many countries to be able to see the trends of endemicity in particular countries and see how, given the restrictions that were put in place into most countries, how they affected, how the virus is going to spread, slowing down the virus to be able to give healthcare professionals enough time to prepare for what was coming, maybe time for getting a vaccine, which at the beginning we actually didn't know if we were going to be able to get a vaccine so quick, etc. So part of the modeling that was done during that time was, I would say, the typical mathematical modeling that has been done previously. That includes, modeling with differential equations or networks or agent-based models or stochastic, all the different versions of the modeling. The one thing that has been, I wouldn't say lacking, but the one thing that has interested me in the last years, it's been human behavior and how this affects modeling. And although this has been introduced in models before in some way or another, it's been slow. And how this approach is including some type of social behavior into these models has been somewhat limited because of the complexity of it. So even, in the past, I don't remember, many years ago, I worked on a model, I think it was dengue fever model with behavioral change in the population, but that was very limited. And there are new methodologies that have caught my interest, and it's part of what I have been working recently. So part of the motivation is, we all know, I don't know if we all know, but the typical epidemic models, the typical SIR models, and in this case, it's the same SIR, except that I have S tilde here, where you have a population that is, homogeneous and they're susceptible to interact with the infected and eventually can become infected and move on to the infected class and eventually can recover. And those are the typical curves of a typical SIR model. However, in a more complex scenario, when we have nonlinear relapse into these models, for example, when we try to perhaps model drug addiction, for example, where individuals can relapse and become quote unquote infected again, this nonlinearity going back to the infected class creates very interesting dynamics and somewhat related to what happened during the pandemic and how I'm sure that we all remember. I was very aware of what was going on because I was working directly here with health authorities, and there were a lot of individuals talking about the reproductive number. And every day someone would give a calculation and say, oh, this is, they wouldn't say R0, they would call it RT. At least in Costa Rica, they would call it RT, which is just the R0, depending on time and so on and so forth. But they would give an estimation of the RT almost daily. And most of the time it was under one, and the pandemic just kept going. And I thought that was interesting because they were not taking into account many factors that can make that happen. But anyway, there's nonlinearities in the simple scenarios, which is not so simple, can give some interesting dynamics and give more insight into what this threshold actually say about an epidemic. In the classic epidemic models, we have homogeneity, in terms of behavior. Everybody's the same. And beta typically is the transmission rate. In this case, we have the nonlinear relapse, which is phi, gamma, the recovery rate, and the mortality rate. And we have the incidence function, G, which in this case we're going to keep constant in the classic scenario. And some of the things that we deal with in terms of the classic models were typically used, or I mean, they're very useful, of course, but some limitations, I wouldn't say necessarily problems, but limitations is that, that incidence function is assumed to be constant, which then implies that everybody behaves the same way. When in reality, individuals behave differently and we behave differently under certain conditions. And we can go by country, and within the country, like for example, in Costa Rica, people behave very different than in the US, which are the typical two countries that I follow more closely. And in Costa Rica, people are very passive, and they behave very well. They if the health authorities say you should stay inside, people typically stay inside for the most part, as compared maybe to the US, which is a big country with a lot of people, compared to Costa Rica, which is about 5 million individuals. In the US, it's about 360 more or less, 350 more or less million people. And depending on where you are in the US, different states, they behave very different. People behave very different. Costa Rica, it's more homogeneous how people behave for the most part. And even more so that we have universal healthcare, so people were not necessarily actually afraid to go to the doctor for the most part when they were feeling sick, because everything was covered. So people do change their behavior under certain conditions, even in a place like Costa Rica, which seems more, or it is more homogeneous. They do behave different. We all behave somewhat different under certain conditions, and depending on what our circumstances are. And some of the behavioral differences could be, the epidemiological behavior, which is the health status. For example, in Costa Rica, and I'm sure in many places around the world, during the pandemic, if you were sick, you were not allowed to go to work if you happened to have a job where you had to be physically there. But a lot of people here in the country, what they did was, if the symptoms were mild, they actually went to work and they wouldn't say anything. Because, again, now for the other part, which is the economic behavior. The economic conditions for certain individuals did not allow them to just stay home and say, hey, I have symptoms. Can you do a test and see if I have the virus, etc. No, some individuals under certain circumstances had to go to work. So there, for example, big differences in how when some people felt sick and they felt safe to go to the doctor, get tested, and they stay home, then nothing happened. Other individuals could not afford to do that, and they went to work anyway, and we know how that goes. And the epidemic tends to spread, even though, well, I'll talk about the example of Costa Rica later on. So in terms of the constant one, which is, this is kind of like escalating to like the adaptive, and then eventually like what we are working on currently, which is still early on, which is multi-layer networks. So the idea is to model context from one health compartment to another. And here, instead of having the typical beta transmission rate times susceptible times the proportion of individuals that are sick, I over N, is to actually disaggregate the context and say, even though it remains constant, we disaggregate them and say, well, the S's are going to have contacts with this many individuals, the I's are going to have contacts with this many individuals, and the S tilde or temporarily recover are going to have contacts with this many individuals for all time, and that's it, and see how that works out. So that was the earlier stuff that we did, and we published it in 2023. I think it was early 2023. And we had some interesting theoretical results. This is with the nonlinear relapse model, which is it's more complex than the typical SIR, and mainly because we wanted to see if the nonlinearity going back to the I class was going to keep the same behavior as if you don't have the disaggregated context. We had some ratios that were important. You know, those R sub mu's and R sub v's are typical in this kind of scenarios. But the kappas and the theta were the ratio between the number of contacts of the infected versus susceptibles and the temporarily recovered over the normal susceptible, the number of contacts that each individual has. Turns out that theta was actually quite important, at least in this analysis. We rescaled the model in this case just for convenience, a normalized model. It was easier to deal with mathematically. And we found, which is in this case, it wasn't surprising, we found a cubic form in terms of the equilibria, and we're able to find conditions under which we can have the three positive roots, which was very convenient. And it turns out that the theta was actually the most important one. I think, yes, I included some of the bifurcation graphs. I've always been interested in this type of behavior, which is the backward bifurcation or this type of bifurcations. This is a forward-backward bifurcation, which basically indicates that in the cubic form, we can have three positive roots under certain conditions. And in here, we have four different regions. And it turns out that if you have the R0, which is dependent on the number of contacts that individuals have with the infected, if that is greater than 1, you can actually have, yes, an endemic equilibrium, except that it can actually be very, very small. Or it could be very, very big, and that depends on the initial conditions, which is something that is typical when you have this type of applications. There are other examples of applications of this in drug addiction, alcohol use, and other examples. This is more a very abstract theoretical example that we worked on. And this is just, they're very similar because here the kappa is the one that was changing. And if we change theta enough, now the forward-backward bifurcation turns into a typical backward bifurcation, which means that the number of roots is just 2. So we have a quadratic form. And again, R0 less than 1, just like in the previous example, doesn't guarantee disease-free. And here it's the same. It is highly dependent on the initial conditions of the initial mass of how many infected you have, or some example of how many drug addicts you have in an area or alcoholics you have in an area, depending on the social phenomena that you try to model. And those are the examples that I recall that I've seen. So it's highly depending on initial conditions. And this has also been done for some infectious diseases as well. So it's highly depending on the initial conditions, and you can actually have, a disease-free when R0 is less than 1, or you can have an endemic equilibrium, even if R0 is less than 1. So in order to be in region 1, R0 has to be significantly, in some examples, less than 1. So you have to be, in this example, between 0 and 0.7. Now, when I mentioned about the R of T being less than 1 during the pandemic in Costa Rica, and someone will compute it and say, it's 0.7 or 0.8 or 0.9 or whatever, and the pandemic just kept going. The first thing that I imagined was this kind of behavior and something that is missing in the calculation, because we still have an endemic. The pandemic wasn't going away. So we had a critical mass. So it was enough to keep the pandemic going, which was true. And even though we had that, the R of T less than 1, which I wasn't a fan of, because I wasn't sure how these groups were computing. There were different groups doing the same thing. Well, this is the same for different parameters and the time series when they get to either the really tiny equilibrium or the big one, depending on the initial conditions. In the more interesting region, at least mathematically, which is the region 3. So this is a part of my thoughts, and I had worked on similar problems, not with this adaptive methodology, but with regular ODEs. And I was very interested in how these models were somewhat, I would say, lacking in some sense this type of social determinants and how to incorporate the social determinants, which has been tried in many scenarios, and I'm very interested in this. I don't have all the answers yet. I'm not sure even if what we're doing is necessarily actually all that interesting yet, but we'll see. At least what we did with this model, I thought it was very interesting. We'll see with the network stuff if it's something that will yield some good results. So the first thing that we worked on and published was last year in 2020, I think it was early 2023, and it was constant. It wasn't adaptive. It was just we disaggregated the number of contacts that individuals had. So it wasn't necessarily that people were changing their behavior. It was just, I guess, a more detailed way of formulating the contact structure. However, with the adaptive behavior, we implemented that with the same nonlinear relapse model. And I was interested in this methodology, which I first learned of in, I believe it was, Baltazar can correct me, I think it was 2018 at Brown, where my group went to Brown to talk to Carlos Castillo's group at the time. We were doing machine learning stuff with dengue and that kind of stuff. And Baltazar, who's here, gave a talk about this adaptive methodology paper from Fenichel and others from 2011, I believe, 2015, no, 2011. And I really enjoyed the talk and the methodology that Baltazar presented. And I was very interested in working with that methodology. So I started with some of my group members to work on that right away. And then 2020 happened. And then I think everybody in the world was sort of sidetracked and either hiding or doing something else. Well, I would say, fortunate that I got to work with public health authorities here, doing modeling for authorities and seeing if we can give them some input so they can make decisions. It was just, at least my team was, they just gave input, and they had inputs from many other groups. After a while, I got back into wanting to work with this methodology of the adaptive behavior using these ODE models. So we did the same model, the non-linear relapse model, and we wanted, so the same model that I just talked about, this model, but instead of having the disaggregated structure and just keeping it constant, now it's actually adaptive. So it changes at every delta t. So every individual, quote unquote, will have a status, either SI or S tilde, and we'll have a maximum of contacts. That is the general structure. In terms of the ODEs, which is the model remains the same, except that now the individuals change based on what's going on, and it changed at every time step. Now that creates a massive theoretical challenge, which we started doing some things, but we are, I wouldn't say, we're stuck. We had some advances, and we didn't stop. We're trying to see if there's anything that we will be able to do theoretically, but at least numerically, we did some simulations, and eventually that led us to sort of like work in parallel with computational models to see if we can get some insight into what's going on with this type of model. So at least getting stuck at some point led us to think of the same problem but with a different structure, and we'll see where that takes us. So when we have the nonlinear relapse, not obviously, but like I mentioned before, they're more complex because of the type of equilibria that you have, the type of applications that you can get, and getting those conditions to have the positive roots is not always a trivial thing to do. In this case, we were able to find the conditions in terms of like these thresholds, and at least for this example, it worked okay. And we can actually introduce even more complex interactions by modifying that G function. And we did just using the regular ODE model, where we actually have a reducing function and being part of G, where we actually can not only adapt the number of contacts, but also include another function in terms of what's going on, in terms of actually a function that depends on some parameters and depends also on some of the variables of the model and acts as a reduction function. We didn't include it in this particular example, but that's something that we can do. Again, the theoretical part of it, we're currently working on it and see if we can actually get some theoretical results, but that's proven to be quite the challenge. Like I said, in the formulation of the adaptive framework, which is that we can disaggregate this context but in this case not keep it constant, but just change it at every time step depending on the health status of individuals. And that's something that we can somewhat, I wouldn't say manipulate, but it depends on other stuff, like utility functions and things like that. So for this Markov decision process, we have this transition probabilities where we can actually see how people move within the model. And for the Markov decision process of this adaptive framework, so it depends on the health status of the individual and how many contacts an individual chooses every day. And then it optimizes the process. In the lack of relapse, which means that we have a typical SIR, the recovered class, they don't really make any decision. And really what matters most in these scenarios are the susceptible, because they are the ones that actually will drive, in this case, the infection. When we have a relapse scenario, now we have two decision processes, which is the susceptible individuals and the individuals that have been temporarily recovered. So those are two decisions going on at the same time. That creates also quite a challenge. And here with the adaptive framework, we have the susceptible and the temporarily recovered, and we can see over time how the optimal contexts do change over time depending on what's going on in this particular example. And that really depends on the kind of utility functions that we use. And at least in this example, we use a typical, with a global optimum. And now the question is, if we use different types of utility functions, how will this change? Let's say we have different optimums. How will this change? Or if we change the curvature of this utility function, how will this change? Well, it does change. It does change a bit. And I think we explored maybe a few other examples as well. But that's also another interesting question that arises from this methodology, which is the type of utility function that can be used in this adaptive framework, which I find fascinating. And I think it's still in the very early stages of seeing what can be done with this methodology and the type of examples and things that can be done. Again, this is it looks like a typical SIR, which it is, except that this is with adaptive behavior and no relapse. And well, here the difference is somewhat clear because adaptive versus disaggregated is just the adaptive changes at every time step. Disaggregated just remains constant. In both cases, we have the typical bifurcation of the scenarios, which doesn't change. And again, if we change the theta, which is the ratio of contact between susceptibles, it will change into a backward bifurcation. And again, this is all highly dependent on initial conditions. The adaptive and non-adaptive models, the complexity of the formulation of the adaptive makes it incredibly challenging to obtain analytical results when it comes to finding equilibria, which is typically what we want to, at least for these ODE models, what we want to study and see if there's anything local that we can say about these equilibrium points, or in the best case scenario, something globally. It has been very challenging. We made some progress at some point, and we're still not necessarily giving up, but we're trying to see if there's anything else that we can do, even with a simpler model, which is with no relapse. But it's incredibly challenging. We compared the adaptive model with the disaggregated model at the beginning of the epidemic. I think I included that graph here, yes. And we used some parameters that are just for examples, just for the sake of the simulation, yes. And here, in terms of the adaptive, which is the green curve, and the non-adaptive, which is the somewhat pink curve, what we see is, yes, there is a difference. There is somewhat of a delay in the growth of the epidemic in this scenario, and a little lower proportion of the infected, which is not surprising in the sense that if individuals are changing their behavior because of what's going on, they change it so that they just keep on with their normal lives. And change behavior could be, taking at least, or maybe not having too many contacts or avoiding certain situations, but life goes on. This is what we would see. This is different than, for example, during the pandemic, where everything was, at least here in Costa Rica, everything was shut down, just completely. A week into the first case, which was March 6th of 2020, which was coincidentally the first day of the first semester, because we start here, our summers are from December through March. So that was the first day of classes, and that was the first day that we got a case in Costa Rica. And then that was Monday, and then by Thursday, everybody goes home, and within a couple of weeks, everything is shut down, and people did change their behavior drastically. But my point is that with this delay in the infection, here it's a more typical, not pandemic scenario, but in a pandemic scenario, and perhaps it would have been a good example to showcase that figure here. But in the pandemic scenario, for example, in Costa Rica, the first couple of weeks, or even 4 or 5 weeks, or even more, the number of cases did not increase significantly. It was very small. So what the reaction of the population was, which is something that it pertains to this work that I'm interested in, is then people started saying that the pandemic was a fraud, like it's not happening, it doesn't exist, and it's just the government trying to keep us inside and blah blah blah, because really the number of cases was not increasing and nobody was dying. And because of the economic pressure, after a certain number of weeks, they had to make some decisions in how we're going to let people out again, how we're going to open up again. So they started slowly opening up, and here they couldn't go back. I saw in some places, maybe in Europe and the US, where they would close and open and close and open in some situations. Here, you couldn't do that. So when they open, that's it, it's open. And they just could keep opening. They were not going back. People were not going to be able to survive. What they did was just they kept opening, whatever they closed down, churches, commerce, etc., because of the economic pressure. And that delay in getting the massive amount of cases that eventually we got, which was not surprising, it gave them time to prepare. The hospitals, the ICU beds, which, we had to almost quadruple the number of ICU beds to be able to contain the individuals that were critical. What we couldn't reproduce was the number of ICU personnel. We were able to get the ICU equipment, but not the personnel. So the people that were taking care of the ICU patients were regular nurses, regular doctors. So that was another situation. But those number of weeks, what gave them was that delay prepared them to what was coming. That's an extreme scenario. In a more typical scenario, like for example, dengue is endemic in Costa Rica. Right now we have a bunch of cases, which is not necessarily surprising because we had a couple of years where the number of cases was really small, and every couple of years it goes up because the pool of susceptible increases again. But in terms of like dengue, influenza, and other diseases, including malaria, which has been an increasing problem in the last 2 years in Costa Rica because of the northern border with Nicaragua. They do have a lot of cases in Nicaragua, and it has been permeating to Costa Rica in the last couple of years, where we almost didn't have any cases of malaria. So this could be a good way to model those scenarios where we actually try to see if the adaptive, based on what's going on, if it makes a difference. Besides just like, for example, in this theoretical example, just a delay and a slight decrease. So some of the things that we actually want to do is the extensions. It's actually the future work is here now. It's not future anymore, because that's what we're doing as of now. So multi-layer network models. This is what we actually did during the pandemic. We actually did a multi-layer network model where We had three layers, which was the household context, the social context, and the sporadic context. And we had a lot of information, right? So these network models, they're as good as the information that you may have if you're applying it to a particular problem, a real world problem. So we had access to all the information, daily information. We had initial conditions that were great, at least for the first, I think it was 2 months, more or less. So we were able to trace, all the different infected individuals and where they were in the country. So we had great initial conditions, and then we had, everything that we needed for the model, and it worked out pretty well. So we were able to project short term, we were able to project the number of cases or the trend. Really, the number was not that relevant, but the trend of how the pandemic was going. And I was very interested in the social aspect and the social determinants, because there was one time where I, as the leader of the research team, I said, well, if the number of, I think it was the number of individuals in hospital beds was this level, people were going to change their behavior and behave better and try to, stay home or whatever. And so we incorporated that into this network model. And it failed miserably. So I was like, well, how and why? I mean, the model did what the model did, which is fine, but people did not behave that way. Actually, it was the complete opposite. It just kept growing. And they were no longer scared because it had been already a few months, or maybe more than a few months, maybe a year. And the economic strain on individuals was now larger than the fear of the pandemic. And people just didn't care anymore because they had to eat, they had to work, and talking about in general terms. So I was fascinated by the fact that this was how, looking back, how things worked out. Now, very interested in adapting this adaptive behavior, this new methodology into these network models, perhaps, something like a multi-layer network model, to see if we can actually incorporate some of these types of behavior in these models. And because of the level of detail, and because it's all simulation based, and the level of details that we can actually have, and the fact that at least for a particular example, we do have information like the pandemic, and see how it would have worked out if, people behave in this way or that way, etc. So expanding the application of this adaptive behavior, which is really what I'm interested in now, which is this network models, and I really wanted to. We do have some results. We're not ready to share them yet, but we do have some results on this network models. So by allowing individuals to adjust the contact rates at the node level based on the perceived risk of an epidemic, we can see how this moves the needle. And we do have specific information, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to try this. And the potential for developing this type of models and specific applications in epidemiology and social phenomena, which is something that have been very interested in, because infectious diseases are social diseases. Most of the time, not most of the time, but most of the time, because vector-borne diseases are, the mosquito can actually move a little bit and move the virus very locally. But individuals, people move the virus for the most part. So we're now exploring integrating these more complex decision-making processes and behavioral patterns in network models. And we have done that already. There's something that we're trying, that we're working out some details. And this adaptive methodology in network models, specifically multi-layer network models, it does offer a promising avenue for developing more responsive epidemiological situations. In 2019, we were very close to, we were doing machine learning with dengue and trying to forecast 3 months in advance. And we had a tool that was going to be implemented here with the health authorities. And the last meeting that we had was in February of 2020, a month before the pandemic hit, at least locally. So we were not able to implement that. But now With these more advanced tools, we still have the connections with the health authorities to be able to perhaps actually not only just have these models and just try to write some papers, but actually to make them work, to see if actually they do work, to see if it's actually a tool that can be used by health authorities and to forecast and things like that. So some of the things of these scenarios is the differential response to outbreaks, that not only a local response is based on policies and awareness and all that stuff, but to, especially in a place like Costa Rica, where some of the resources are limited, so we can actually better optimize resource allocation in some areas, because the way they do it now is a blanket, so everybody gets the same, and not everybody is the same. The impact of travel restrictions, and that played a significant role in the economic situation of Costa Rica, which is a very tourist country. There's a bunch of people from Europe that come to the Caribbean side mostly, and there's a bunch of people from pretty much everywhere the U.S. that goes to the northwest region of Costa Rica, and that created a huge economic burden and here and pretty much everywhere else. So we know that human movement, it's an issue on disease spread. The role of information spread, this is, I think, more difficult because this changes very quickly. Like I said, there was that example of, so the health authorities in Costa Rica were able to contain the spread of COVID early on by pretty much closing down. But the reaction of the population was, wait, this really doesn't exist. COVID is a fraud. That doesn't exist. And that was influenced also by the misinformation from social networks and YouTube and all that stuff. The economic consequences and adaptations, that has a significant impact. I question now if these tools were already up and working and we had a situation like COVID, how will these tools fare compared to what was done, which was the typical SIR models and network models, etc. Would they be actually better? Is it the same? I'm not sure. I think they will be better, but I'm not sure yet. Vaccination campaigns and the hesitancy, well, we all know now that has been quite a controversial topic in recent years, mostly because of COVID. Actually, even before COVID, it had started to become an issue, at least in some places. Here, it's very ingrained into the culture to vaccinate. Although, you hear, people saying, oh, the vaccine causes whatever, autism, or people are dying now because of the COVID vaccine. But that's the minority. What you heard on the news during the pandemic in Costa Rica was the noise. So the people that were, against the vaccines and all that stuff, because that's what makes the news. But in reality, I believe more than 92% of the population got vaccinated for COVID. So that's a huge percentage. At least here, that is not yet a big problem. Although it started to permeate, what was going on even prior to COVID. The cross-layer interactions, that's also part of the, information, how misinformation affects, pretty much everything that goes on with health authorities. The system capacity, healthcare system capacity, that played a role, at least during the pandemic. And I'm sure that is everywhere because no one was ready for what was coming. For example, for COVID, which is a recent example. Like I mentioned here, and I'm sure in other places was the same. Healthcare capacity had to increase very quickly in a few weeks. And at least here, they were able to get a lot of the equipment, but they were taking med students out of school to work in hospitals because we had a certain capacity, but we didn't have the personnel. And luckily, it was borderline almost collapsing, but it never collapsed. But it was close. It was very close. So being ready for those situations. Even recently, we had some situations recently in the last few months with influenza and kids. And, we have a specific hospital here for kids, and it was packed with kids with respiratory diseases, that were somewhat critical and stuff. Oh boy, that was That was a lot. Okay, so these are some of the references from my colleague Baltasar, some of the stuff that we worked on. It was 2011, Fenichel no for that methodology and some of the stuff that I've done and others as well. So thank you, and just let me know if you have any particular questions.
Thanks, Fabio, for the talk. I'm Lucas here at Oklahoma State.
Hi, Lucas.
I enjoyed very much your talk. I was very curious about the first model you presented and the fact that you observe this endemic equilibrium, stable endemic equilibrium when R naught is less than 1. I wonder if what you can tell, or if you have a disease-free equilibrium in this case, and what you can tell about the stability of the disease-free equilibrium in this state for this model.
Yes, that is a good question, actually, because one of the things that we look for when we have this type of behavior is when will we have a disease-free if things are so bad when we have this type of behavior. Well, what we can say about the disease-free with this type of models, not necessarily with this one, with this type of models where you have this either backward bifurcation, which is this one, or a forward backward bifurcation. This is a cubic and the endemic equilibrium, this is a quadratic. So what we can say about the disease-free is that we have to have an R0 has to be way less than 1 to have a disease-free, which means that there are other factors that even if you have an R0, which is less than 1, which typically means disease-free, typically, if you have in region 2, for example, if you have this region, which R0 is less than 1, you can have a disease-free. It really depends on the I star, which is the infected equilibrium. It depends on the initial conditions. So if you have a critical mass of infected, then you will have an endemic equilibrium. But let's say if there's an area where you have not so many infecteds around, then you will have a disease-free. So I believe, and this is not, this backward bifurcation, this behavior is from the 80s with Carlos and Horst Dima. I think the first paper was in 89. So this is not new. I've just been very interested in this type of behavior, which just, to me, it represents a more realistic approach to these ODE models, because typically we say, oh, if we have R0 less than 1, but really, how can we get R0 less than 1? Then we don't have an epidemic. But we don't take into account social factors, which I think this somewhat represents, kind of like there's something else. For example, critical mass in this particular example. And going even further, if you look at region 3, we have R0 greater than 1, which typically means an epidemic. So we do have that. But if you have, let's say, an area where you have a very small number of infected, you can actually do have an endemic, but that endemic will be very, very small. Okay. And I can, at least here locally, right? And I talk about Costa Rica because that's where I am. And I've been working with the health authorities for a number of years now. So I know some of the information regarding like dengue and influenza and COVID. And I can tell you some of the areas, actually, I can pinpoint areas where this will happen and this will happen. So the lower endemic and the higher endemic based on population density and how people actually behave. And we actually computed some of that. And it turns out that, yes, because there are some areas, for example, where R0 was greater than 1, but you don't have an epidemic because people are isolated in these very rural places where they don't have a lot of contacts. Their neighbors are, their farms are like acres of land, and they don't really. And if you come to the city here, maybe not here, well, the university, there's like 40,000 students. Yes, there's a bunch of people, and in the city, it's very packed, and it's not a big area. So those are some examples of what happens, right? So it's highly dependent on initial conditions. That's the key points.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again. It was really a fantastic talk. Good to see all these folks here. And we wish you the very best. We invite you to come to any future seminars that we have. We would love to have your input.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Erin and Baltasar. And hopefully we'll be in touch very soon.
Thank you again, and everyone have a great day.